Okay, yeah, nothing gets your attention like the countdown. Okay, let's review briefly who the Pilgrims were, because Thursday we discovered what a pilgrim is, what a Puritan is, what influence the Protestant Reformation had on groups like the Pilgrims and the Puritans. So let's just back up here. 1620, dealing with the group we call the Pilgrims. How would you describe the religious identity of said Pilgrims? What made them unique? What is one thing that made them unique?
They brought women and children.
All right, so let's talk about their settlement. They're going to settle. The Pilgrims will establish Plymouth Plantation. The fact they call it a plantation tells us their original intent was to settle down and do plantation agriculture where? Originally, they had intended to settle in Virginia. Yeah, Jack is mouthing the correct answers, but he lacks the confidence to proclaim them. They bring women along with them, which is unique compared to the southern plantation colonies where indentured servants were mostly men hoping to make money and return to England. The Puritans of Plymouth Plantation brought women, which tells us they intended to stay and raise their families there. Okay? Their religious identity is part of the reason why they plan to stay. So I'm still waiting to find out what about Puritanism defined these people. Okay, help me understand what a Puritan is. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church because remember, thanks to Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the Catholic Church had been removed from power in England, and the Anglican Church had risen to be the established Church of England over the 16th century. By the time we get to the 1620s, you're absolutely right. The word Puritan means to purify. And one of the things they wanted to purify about the Anglican Church was who was a member. And this takes us to one of the big identity factors about Puritans. Who did the Puritans believe could or should be a member of the Anglican Church? Only people that had the conversion experience, right? God had told these people that experienced the conversion experience that they were saved and destined for heaven, right? This should help you a little bit further about this identity of Puritan people, okay? This idea of conversion is also connected to this probably primary idea. What did Puritans believe about heaven and hell and salvation? And what's that term for predetermined destiny? Predestination. There we go, predestination. So the Puritans believed in these ideas of predestination. From the beginning of time, God had decided who was going to heaven, who was going to hell. And we had a whole big conversation about what kind of life you would live if you knew or didn't know that no matter how you behaved, your destiny was already chosen. Predestination and conversion experiences are all part of Puritanism. Who was the guy? Who was the Dutch reformer that develops these ideas about predestination and conversion? This is the reformer that's similar to Martin Luther. John Calvin. So the Puritans and Pilgrims were Calvinists. We have now identified what the identity of these folks are. We know that they ran against the English church, and the English church under James II told them to get it straight. When some of them refused to do so, they became separatists, believing the only way that they could purify the church was to leave. Those pilgrims go to the Netherlands. If you go to our trip in Europe in 2021, we are going to visit Rotterdam, the city in the Netherlands that the pilgrims left from on their voyage to North America in 1620. I don't know exactly what there is to see there, but we know they had a big prayer circle before they stepped onto the Mayflower. So these separatists took a religious pilgrimage, hoping for Virginia, end up where today is Massachusetts, and set up a plantation they called Plymouth. Before they got off that Mayflower, they gathered together in the ship. They gave thanks to God that they all survived, which was a miracle in and of itself. And they established a constitution of sorts, right? The Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact's important because, number one, it guaranteed the members, the citizens of Plymouth, their rights as Englishmen. Okay. Number two, it identified what kind of government they were going to set up, which was theocratic, a government based on the religion of their blend of Christianity. But probably most important, it identified who was a member of that community. Okay. Who received citizenship in the Plymouth plantation? What kinds of people? You became a member of the Plymouth plantation if you met three criteria. Number one, you were male. Number two, white. Now we got to move to four. You're right. White, male. You had to be a member of the church, which meant you needed that conversion experience. So white males of the church, right, that owned property. Okay? So, in other words, all the white men on the ship who professed that they had this conversion experience were now citizens of Plymouth. What's remarkable about that is that Plymouth is going to conduct itself kind of like a democracy, a commonwealth. That means the citizens are going to vote and make decisions for their communities and for the plantation. We know that the Pilgrims had their first Thanksgiving in 1621. They were saved by the Narragansett Indians, led by Squanto. And you know that story. At first, the Pilgrims were very grateful for their relationship with the natives because they came entirely unprepared for life in Massachusetts. That's going to change, and tomorrow we'll discuss how over the 17th century, the Pilgrims, as they needed more and more land, came into closer contact and conflict with the Pequot in what today is Connecticut and other Native American tribes. Famous names to remember: William Bradford, the leaders of the Puritans, and the fact that Plymouth today, we don't have a state of Plymouth. We have a state of Massachusetts. One of the big objectives today is to talk about how the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the next big wave of Puritans to come to the New World, actually is really the cornerstone of New England society. It became a bigger, more prominent colony and actually took over the Plymouth plantation colony in the 17th century. Okay, so step one is to understand why a big wave of Puritans came to the New World in the 1630s, roughly a decade after Plymouth. Okay, normally we talked about in the past how necessity or desperation will lead people to migrate, lead people to take risks, right? People that are comfortable don't take risks. In the 1630s, first of all, two terms. Number one, English Civil War. Number two, Great Migration. Anytime there's civil war, there's going to be fear, there's going to be desperation. And in the 1630s, England plunged into a civil war. The English Civil War was fought between those that supported a stronger parliament, and the people that supported the parliament were led by a military Puritan by the name of Oliver Cromwell. Okay, Cromwell will become the prime minister and then the militant dictator of England after the English Civil War. But when it starts off, King Charles I is persecuting Puritans, arresting them, killing them as traitors. And so this is why nearly 200,000 Puritans leave England in the 1630s. Okay, those Puritans It's no longer safe for them to be there because of the Civil War. And so a portion of those 200,000 Puritans make their way to New England under the leadership of John Winthrop, who you read about, right? By the way, what was the metaphor, or what was the figure of speech that Winthrop uses to describe how this new colony will be when they get to the New World? What? Who said it?
A city on a hill.
A city on a hill. And for those of you that went to Bible school, you know this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, right? That song is from the same part of the Bible about creating a model to show God's light and love to the rest of the world that's dark in sin. Winthrop and the Puritans, when they leave in 1630, want to create a theocracy, want to create a society that will act as a model of Christian charity. A couple of maps here for you. First of all, a map of Great Britain. Down here, and it's hard to kind of see on the board, the red blotches. Here in Dorset, Somerset, southwestern England, and over here, Essex and Kent on eastern English coast, those were the woolen districts. This is where most Puritans came from. The factory towns, blue collar, if you will. Politically and economically, things were very tough for the Puritans. So they come to the New World for economic opportunity as well. But their religious identity is what we remember. As I said, almost 200,000 Puritans leave England. It's that unsafe for them under Charles I's reign. But what we also need to recognize is most of those Puritans didn't go to New England. They went to other places. They went to the Caribbean. They went to the southern colonies like Virginia and South Carolina. But about 10%, a little more than 10%, did go to the northern colonies. Why then is the influence of Puritanism strongest in the north if most Puritans didn't go north? This is easy answer. Think of proportions.
Concentration.
The concentration of Puritanism is strongest in New England. If you're making Kool-Aid and you water it down, the concentration is weaker. So those Puritans that went to the South and went to the Caribbean, that was watered down, where the concentration of Puritans in the North, up by Massachusetts, was strongest. And they become the political and economic force of that region. John Winthrop is the leader of these 1630s pilgrims, and they show up in Massachusetts Bay. Cape Cod, that physical feature of geography tells you a lot about the opportunities of these New England Puritans. Okay? They don't call themselves a plantation because, frankly, they already know plantation agriculture isn't going to be their bread and butter. They're going to have a diverse agricultural system. And please get these things down because these are the economic differences between New England and southern colonies. The Puritans are going to practice subsistence farming. Sina, last week you told us what subsistence farming means. What is it? Yeah. What does it mean to have subsistence farming?
You like live off of it.
You live off of it. 90% of the population is going to be a subsistence farmer. They're going to grow crops like wheat and corn and beans for themselves, not for profit, but to live off of. But it's that 10%, that small group of others that really help define the economy of New England. What's the big physical feature New England is shaped around? Cape Cod. Fishing, shipping, lumber mills, okay? Small businesses suited to give products to the people that live in that area. That's going to make a very diverse economy for New England. The South will live and die by plantation agriculture. If crop prices are high, the South will do well. If crop prices are low, the South will be in recession. New England doesn't face those big swings. Their economy is much more diverse, and it's based around subsistence farming, and trade. Okay? New England will become the trade center of the 13 colonies. There's not any surprise to anyone that the ships full of tea that the colonists vandalized during the Boston Tea Party happens in New England, happens in Boston, Massachusetts. Okay, that is the most important port in all of the colonies by the time we get to 1770s. Okay? But the importance of religion permeates New England. Okay, from who can be a citizen to what their cities even look like. We talked a little bit last week about how the church of the Puritans became known as the Congregational Church. The Congregational Church was run by its members, and members had to have that conversion experience. The church itself wasn't even called a church, it was called a meeting house. It's where the government center was. All the political and religious businesses happened in this meeting house, and the meeting house was built smack dab in the middle of the city. Okay, all roads converged at the meeting house. So this just demonstrates how important theocracy was to people of New England. The more important in the church you were, the more important in society you were. Okay? You had to be white, you had to own property, you had to have the conversion experience in order to vote. Originally, the Puritans were a commune. Somebody brought up the Amish last week and said, are they the Amish, the guys with the big beards and the suspenders? No. Okay, the Amish are most closely related to the Quakers, and we will talk about the Quakers soon. But the Puritans lived in a communal society at first. In fact, they flirted with communism when they first got to Boston. Okay, where no one owned private property. They worked together, they farmed together, they lived together, but they quickly realized that the weaker members, those that were lazier, were benefiting, and so the ownership of private property was important to people of New England as well. Okay, they quickly adopted the capitalism of the southern colonies. They developed laws. Your book refers to them as blue laws, okay? They were moral laws, laws based upon the teaching of the Bible. For example, it was illegal for unmarried couples to associate with one another outside the presence of a witness so that, no fornication would take place. It was illegal for married couples to hold hands and show signs of affection to one another in a public place. Don't get me, homosexuality, fornication, or adultery, all of those kinds of Christian sins would be punishable severely through fines, through public humiliation, through corporal punishment, beatings and floggings, and even the death penalty. Okay, when we get to the end of the 17th century, the 1690s, that's when the Salem witch trials take place. Okay, the Salem witch trials really represent the end of an era. It's the final kind of attempt to use theocracy in the colonies. And we're going to talk a little bit here about outsiders, people that ran against the laws of New England and what happened to them, people like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. But at the end of the 17th century, when we get the Salem witch trials, we can see people are being put to death because they're accused of witchcraft. The Puritans believed that their relationship with God was intimate and direct. What do I mean by that? It means the Puritans believed that if they did something wrong, God wouldn't just punish them in the afterlife, God would punish them now. So if someone's cow died, it was because perhaps they had committed a sin. If there was a fire, it was perhaps because God was upset with how the community was behaving. If somebody lied or cheated or committed adultery, it had consequences for them not just in the afterlife, but in the life here and now. And so they would look to those kinds of explanations. And in the Salem witch trials, we see what starts as a small affair, a small offense, some kids dancing in the woods, right? Engaging in vain pursuits of enjoyment, having pleasure for pleasure's sake. They're so wrapped up about that, they start accusing one another of other kinds of crimes, including adultery, including theft. And they turn their attention towards the weakest members of society: single, older, poor women. And so many of the people that were killed in the Salem witch trials met those criteria. They were voiceless because they weren't men, they were voiceless because they didn't own property, or they were voiceless because they held a low social status for one reason or another. Okay? Those laws shape theocracy. One of the more famous individuals who faced criticism in New England society is a woman. I think it's important we look at women's roles throughout history. All the history stories, it seems like 10 to 1, are men, and that's not fair. It's because history through much of history was written by men, and people tend to write about themselves in a positive spin. But Anne Hutchinson is a very important figure in colonial New England. She was a woman who was very strong-spoken. I love my quotes over here on the board. Well-behaved women seldom make history. And Anne Hutchinson kind of felt like you guys did when I brought up predestination. And some of you said, well, if I knew that nothing I did mattered in my own salvation, I would just have a party. I'd do whatever I wanted to do because there's nothing I can do to control my own salvation. Well, antinomianism is a big word, but it has a simple meaning. The belief that you answer to one power, and that's God. And Anne Hutchinson started telling people that God was speaking to her directly. She started leading worship services and Bible studies and teaching men about the Word of God, which was a huge faux pas in Puritan society. So she starts preaching and teaching the Bible, and which violates the laws of the Puritans, where the Bible is clear that only men can be priests or teachers of the gospel. And so she gets a warning, and then she gets arrested. And then, because she doesn't stop, because she has this attitude that the laws don't matter, all that matters is God has told me I'm saved. The higher-ups, people like John Winthrop, released the most severe punishment outside of the death penalty that they could think of, and that's that they kicked her out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, there's a strong message in that. If the Massachusetts Bay Colony is the city upon a hill, the light to the darkness of the world, to get kicked out of the colony, that's to be kicked out into the mortal world of sin with no chance of salvation. So they kick her out. And for a while, she runs south to a territory that's being developed by other undesirables, okay, Rhode Island. Now, you have to have a sense of geography to fully appreciate this, but Rhode Island is this wooded area south of Massachusetts where people who couldn't hack it in Massachusetts went. And they were led by a guy by the name of Roger Williams, who got in trouble with the church for criticizing Puritans for taking land from Native Americans without paying them, right? Well, in Puritans' attitude, a Christian could take the land from a pagan and do something with it to create and worship God or to expand God's kingdom. They had no problem taking land from natives. Roger Williams starts criticizing the church, and he finds himself kicked out as well. And so these people who couldn't hack it in the rigid world of Puritans start migrating southward to Rhode Island. There was a saying amongst Puritans that the sewage of New England, God's sewage of New England, traveled south to Rhode Island. So Anne Hutchinson goes to Roger Williams and lives in Rhode Island for a time before she gets in trouble again for being a strong vocal opponent of the leadership of Rhode Island, and they chase her out of Rhode Island into what is upstate New York. Okay, so she is kicked out of both of these inhabited places, and she's in upstate New York. She and her family, and she had like 11 or 12 kids, build a cabin in the woods, and that cabin is attacked by Native Americans. Okay, her family is decimated. I think only one of her children survive. The entire family is killed and scalped, and word gets back to Boston that Anne Hutchinson has been killed by by Indians, and they celebrate it as a colonial holiday. Okay, they celebrate Anne Hutchinson's murder because they think that this is a sign of God's divine justice. This proves that they were right, that Anne Hutchinson was a sinner, a heretic against the church, and deserved the worst possible outcome for her mortal life. And so they celebrate her demise as a colonial holiday. Of course, what we celebrate Anne Hutchinson for now is as a early feminist, as someone that recognized the hypocrisy of Puritan society in its treatment of other people, but also as a symbol of just how hardcore the Puritans were, in that they created this religious place for themselves and not for dissenters. And go back to Roger Williams here and Rhode Island. So the Plymouth Plantation is going to merge with Massachusetts Bay. So there's basically one large colony, and then Rhode Island becomes a second colony where people who couldn't hack it end up. Okay? This particular colony is inhabited by some people that today we would say sound awfully American. Okay? Roger Williams pays Indians for their land. He allows everyone to worship however they choose. There is no religious law in New Hampshire, in Rhode Island. You can be a man, you can be a citizen as long as you are male, right? As long as you are a male. So universal male suffrage is something that other states and colonies aren't going to adopt until the 1830s. He protects the Quakers, who had been abused by the Puritans as well. It's, in other words, the most liberal colony amongst the 13. The nickname for Rhode Island today is the state of the otherwise minded. If you think about like East Coast liberalism, places that believe in absolute personal freedom and yet care or social support for those that have limited wealth, Rhode Island is a very liberal state. So it's the state of the otherwise minded, and it tends to run kind of on its own set of terms. If you're ever experiencing or discussing the differences from regions, Rhode Island is the exception to New England, and it's kind of the exception to any kind of conservative movement you're dealing with in the colonial era. All right, I need to wrap up because we're getting close here. So while Rhode Island is shaped because of religious dissent, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, those are going to be expansion zones for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and I'll talk about that more tomorrow.